Representatives finally elected a new speaker on Saturday in a series of historic votes that took 5 days and 15 rounds of voting. Western Mass News reporter Maria Wilson joins us live in studio with the latest. Maria?
Kristen, Kevin McCarthy's victory came with plenty of drama, and after the unprecedented ordeal, the California congressman thanked former President Donald Trump for his help along the way. Members of the 118th United States Congress were finally sworn in early Saturday morning after a historic series of votes, an intense ordeal that kept the House from completing any work, according to a rule that says the House can only conduct business after a speaker has been selected. McCarthy overcame intense opposition from a number of hardline conservatives throughout the voting period.
That was easy, huh? I never thought we'd get up here.
After being elected to his dream job during an unprecedented week on the Congress floor. At one point on Friday, Republicans had to be physically restrained from one another because they could not come to an agreement. And moments later, several holdouts changed their course, allowing McCarthy to clinch a victory on the 15th round of voting. Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans will follow up on its, quote, commitment to America. He says their very first bill will be to, quote, repeal funding for 87,000 new IRS agents. And now that a speaker has been selected, the House will try to agree on a set of rules on Monday. For now, reporting live in studio, Maria Wilson, Western Mass News.